There is a place mentioned in the Bible that today lies hidden in the depths of the sea. It spent 2,000 years underwater, hidden in plain sight. The Bible described it precisely, and science has found it. And it is irrefutable proof that what we read in the Bible actually happened. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Get ready, because we are traveling back in time over 3,000 years of history. We are going to explore the 13 exact places mentioned in the Bible that still exist. Some are buried, others submerged, still others hidden in plain sight. But they all answer the big question: is what we read in the Bible true? If you are passionate about discovering the truth, and I hit that like button and stick around until the end, because we are about to reveal something no one has ever told you before. Just 1 kilometer from the barren shores of the Dead Sea, tucked away in the jagged limestone cliffs of the Judean desert, lies a place that holds the ultimate answer to one of history's greatest debates. This is Qumran. For centuries, this desolate landscape was nothing more than dust and silence. But in 1947, it became the stage for a discovery that would leave the academic world speechless. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the conflict. For decades, critics and skeptics had a powerful argument. They claimed the Bible we read today was unreliable. Why? Because the oldest Hebrew manuscripts we possessed dated back only to around 1000 AD. That created a massive 1,000-year gap between the original events and the earliest copies. Skeptics argued that over a millennium of copying and recopying, the text must have been manipulated, altered, or lost in translation. They called it a game of telephone, played over centuries. They were convinced that what we had was a distorted version of the original truth. Then the impossible happened. The story feels more like a legend than a historical record. A young Bedouin shepherd was searching for a lost goat among the crevices of the Qumran cliffs. To see if his animal was hiding in a dark cave, he tossed a stone inside. Instead of a bleat, he heard the sharp, metallic crack of breaking pottery. What he found inside those dark, dusty caves would change history forever. Inside the caves were dozens of sealed clay jars, and within them, wrapped in linen, were hundreds of parchment scrolls. They had been sitting there untouched and forgotten for over 2,000 years. This shepherd had stumbled upon the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest biblical manuscripts ever found, dating from the 3rd century BC to 68 AD. These were texts written before and during the time of Jesus. But why here? Why did these fragile parchments survive in Qumran while others across the globe crumbled into dust? The answer lies in a geological miracle, what we might call the Earth's physical hard drive. You see, Qumran is located at the lowest point on the planet. Here, the atmospheric pressure is higher, the air is thick with salt from the Dead Sea, and the humidity is nearly non-existent. This extreme environment created a natural time capsule. The salt and the utter lack of moisture worked together to deep freeze the organic material of the scrolls. While texts in Rome or Greece were rotting away from mold and moisture, the Judean desert was silently protecting these manuscripts in a sterile, airtight vault. It was a perfect setting of preservation that no human engineer could have designed better. When experts finally unrolled these ancient treasures, they faced the moment of truth. They compared the great Isaiah scroll, a masterpiece 23 feet long and 1,000 years older than any previous copy, to the Hebrew Bibles we use today. The result was stunning. They were practically identical. Word for word, phrase for phrase. Many people look at the data and ask a sharp question. If the scrolls are 95% identical, what happened to the other 5%? Was something lost? It's a valid concern, but the reality is even more fascinating. That 5% gap has nothing to do with the message or the history. It consists entirely of minor spelling variations, changes in grammar over centuries, or small scribal slips. Human errors as simple as a misspelled name or a different way to write a common word. Not a single prophecy was altered. Not a single historical event was changed. For linguists, this 5% isn't proof of corruption. It's proof of the human touch in the preservation process. It shows that despite being copied by hand under flickering oil lamps, the core message remained untouchable. The news was a devastating blow to the critics. The Bible hadn't been rewritten. The text you hold in your hands today is the exact same message that was read in the time of the apostles. But as archaeologists began to dig deeper into the ruins of the nearby settlement, they realized Qumran was hiding even more than just scrolls. They found the remains of a community obsessed with purity, the Essenes. These people gave their lives to ensure that not a single letter of the sacred text would be lost to time. When the Roman legions closed in to destroy Jerusalem in 68 AD, the Essenes made a final, desperate choice. They packed their life's work into jars and sealed the caves, trusting the desert to keep their secret until the world was ready to hear it again. But among the 930 scrolls recovered, one stood apart. It was a find that defied all archaeological logic. It wasn't made of parchment or papyrus. It was made of pure copper. And it wasn't a scripture. It was something far more dangerous. It was the greatest treasure map in human history, pointing to a fortune of gold and silver hidden somewhere in the desert. A fortune that some believe belongs to the Temple of Jerusalem itself. Where is that treasure today? And why has no one been able to find it? Get ready, because that is where our journey takes an even more mysterious turn. While the parchment scrolls of Qumran gave us the Word of God, one discovery gave us something entirely different. In 1952, inside the darkness of Cave 3, archaeologists stumbled upon an object that defied every rule of the desert. It was the so-called copper scroll. Think about the weight of that choice. In an era where parchment and papyrus were the standard for recording history, someone chose to engrave their secrets onto sheets of nearly pure copper. This was not a common practice. Copper was expensive. It was notoriously difficult to work with. It required immense physical effort to hammer every single letter into the metal. So why do it? The answer is simple: permanence. Parchment can rot, leather can be destroyed, but copper was meant to survive the end of the world. This was a message intended to outlast empires and endure the harshest elements of time. It was a hard drive made of metal, designed for a future that hadn't yet arrived. By the time it was found, time had been cruel. The metal was so badly corroded that unrolling it would have caused the entire structure to disintegrate into dust. It was sent to Manchester, where scientists used a saw of surgical precision to cut the scroll into 23 thin strips. When the pieces were finally fitted together, the world was stunned. This wasn't a biblical text. It wasn't a prayer or a prophecy. It was the greatest treasure map in human history. The copper scroll is a meticulous inventory of 64 specific locations. It describes a hoard of staggering proportions: 26 tons of gold and 65 tons of silver, along with precious incense and sacred priestly garments. Experts agree that such immense wealth could not have belonged to the small, ascetic community living at Qumran. Everything points to this being the actual hidden inventory of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, buried in a desperate rush before the Roman legions could breach the city walls in 70 AD. For decades, adventurers and archaeologists have followed these precise directions. They have searched the tunnels, the cisterns, and the deep wells mentioned in the text. Yet the treasure remains one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries. Why? There are three distinct possibilities. First, the landscape has changed. A fourth well, or the entrance to the White Cave, might have been clear landmarks 2,000 years ago, but after centuries of earthquakes, erosion, and shifting sands, those markers have vanished. Second, the instructions are believed to be encoded. The measurements and names may use a secret system known only to the high priests of the temple. And third, there is the chilling possibility that someone got there first. The Romans were masters of torture. Perhaps they forced the locations from a captive priest. Or perhaps in the centuries that followed, the Jewish people themselves recovered parts of their heritage to fund their survival. Today, the scroll sits in the Jordan Museum, a silent roadmap to a fortune that, if found, would be the greatest archaeological discovery of all time. But as we look at these missing treasures, we are forced to confront an even deeper, more unsettling mystery. The copper scroll tells us what was hidden in the desert, but the Bible tells us what was lost in the fires of an earlier war. In 586 BC, when the army of Nebuchadnezzar encircled Jerusalem, the first temple, the magnificent house built by Solomon, was reduced to ash. The Bible provides a meticulous list of the treasures the Babylonians carried off. It mentions gold vessels, bronze columns, and sacred altars. But if you read that list carefully, you will notice a gaping, terrifying hole. The most important object in the entire world is missing. The Ark of the Covenant is nowhere to be found. Think about that. At the Ark was the tangible presence of God on earth. It was the center of the nation's soul. How could it simply vanish from the historical record? If it wasn't stolen by the Babylonians and it wasn't destroyed in the fire, where did it go? This leads us to a possibility that few are willing to consider. Many believe that because no human hand was permitted to touch the ark, it could not be destroyed by human war. Some traditions suggest the priests hid it in a secret labyrinth deep beneath Mount Moriah, in tunnels that remain off-limits to this day. But there is a more profound, almost spiritual theory. Perhaps the ark was not hidden by men at all. Perhaps it was withdrawn by God. Just as the Garden of Eden was closed off from human reach, it is possible that the most sacred objects of the Bible were placed beyond our physical dimension. We search the dust of the earth for gold and silver, but the most precious things may be sealed by a power we cannot measure. This is the great irony of archaeology. We find the stones, we find the copper, and we find the proof that these stories are real. But the most holy things remain just out of reach, hidden not by dirt, but by a divine seal. The silence of the ark is a reminder that some truths are not meant to be dug up. They are meant to be believed. But while the ark remains a mystery, there are other biblical events that left scars on the earth so deep that science can no longer look away. We are moving from the hidden gold of the temple to a rain of fire that turned an entire civilization into glass. Get ready, because the evidence we are about to see in the depths of the Dead Sea is as terrifying as it is irrefutable. For centuries, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah was dismissed as a baseline myth, a terrifying tale of divine judgment designed to scare the ancient world into submission. To the modern mind, the idea of fire and sulfur falling from the sky sounded like a poetic exaggeration. But if the Bible is a record of historical truth, then a catastrophe of that magnitude must have left a physical scar on the earth. Today we have found that scar, and it is more terrifying than we ever imagined. Just a few miles northeast of the Dead Sea lies an archaeological site called Tal el-Hammam. For years, an international team of scientists and researchers meticulously excavated the ruins of this massive, fortified city. What they found beneath the surface left them speechless. They uncovered a destruction layer nearly 5 feet thick, dating back approximately 3,600 years. This wasn't just a layer of ash from a typical city fire. This was evidence of a thermal event so extreme it defies conventional explanation. As the team dug deeper, they found mud bricks that had melted. They found pottery shards that had been vitrified, meaning the clay had literally turned into glass. Think about the physics required for that to happen. To turn solid clay into glass, you need temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. To put that into perspective, that is hotter than a volcanic eruption. It is hotter than the melting point of iron. This wasn't a kitchen fire or a military conquest. This was a heat so intense that it vaporized the very foundations of the city in a matter of seconds. In 2021, after years of peer-reviewed research, the conclusion was published in major scientific journals. The evidence points to a cosmic airburst, a meteor or a fireball that exploded over the city with a force 1,000 times greater than the Hiroshima bomb. The air temperature soared instantly to thousands of degrees. This matches the Genesis account with terrifying precision. Then the Lord rained down sulfur and fire from the heavens. But the discovery didn't stop at the heat. It provided a shocking answer to the most doubted detail of the entire story. The Bible tells us that as Lot's family fled the destruction, his wife looked back and was instantly turned into a pillar of salt. For skeptics, this was the ultimate proof that Sodom was a fable. But forensic geology has revealed a new, chilling insight. Because Tal el-Hammam was situated right at the edge of the Dead Sea, the force of that cosmic explosion did more than just burn the city. The massive pressure wave hit the salt-saturated water of the lake, instantly vaporizing millions of gallons of brine. In a heartbeat, a superheated cloud of boiling salt and toxic minerals was sent screaming across the plain. It was a literal rain of salt. Anyone caught in that thermal wave would not just be burned. They would be instantly encased in a thick, suffocating layer of salt brine. The pillar of salt isn't just a metaphor. It is a clinical description of a high-heat brine encasement, a physical reality of a cosmic catastrophe. And the physical evidence of this rain of fire is still there today, waiting for you to touch it. If you walk along the cliffs surrounding the Dead Sea, you will see something found nowhere else on Earth. Embedded deep within the rock are thousands of white powdery spheres. They are balls of pure sulfur. You can pry them from the wall with your own hands. They are nearly 98% pure sulfur, an anomaly that occurs naturally in no other geological formation. If you hold a flame to one of these balls, it ignites instantly. It burns with an intense, piercing blue flame and releases a pungent, suffocating smell. This is the physical residue of the brimstone described 4,000 years ago. It didn't disappear. It was baked into the very geography of the Jordan Valley as a permanent record of judgment. The impact was so devastating that it didn't just destroy the people, it killed the land itself. The research shows that the explosion pushed so much salt into the topsoil that agriculture became impossible. Archaeology confirms that this fertile valley, once described as the Garden of God, was abandoned. No one returned to live there for generations. The soil was cursed by the salt, leaving the area a barren wasteland for centuries. Today, we look upon the scene of Sodom's destruction, and we see that the Bible wasn't exaggerating. It was describing a forensic reality that science is only now beginning to understand. The ash, the glass, and the sulfur stand as irrefutable proof that when the Bible speaks of fire from heaven, it is describing an event that truly happened. But if the Dead Sea represents the finality of judgment, just a few miles away, the water tells a very different story. We are moving from the scorched earth of Sodom to the most famous river in the world, the Jordan. And as we will see, the miracles that happened at its banks are also being confirmed by the very ground beneath our feet. The Jordan River. It is perhaps the most famous body of water in human history, yet for many who see it for the first time, the reality is a shock. It isn't a vast, majestic waterway. In most places, it is a narrow, muddy stream winding through a desolate valley. But do not let its humble appearance fool you. In the ancient world, this was more than just a river. It was a lethal frontier. It was the black box of a nation's destiny. The Bible presents the Jordan as an impossible barrier. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, the people of Israel finally reached the edge of the Promised Land, standing on the eastern banks. But the book of Joshua records a critical detail. It was harvest time, and the Jordan was in full flood, raging and overflowing its banks. Crossing it was a suicide mission. Then the narrative describes a miracle that has fueled skepticism for millennia. It says that as the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the water, the flow coming from upstream simply stopped. It piled up far away at a town called Adam, while the water downstream emptied into the Dead Sea. The riverbed lay bone dry, allowing an entire nation to walk across. To the modern critic, this sounds like pure mythology, a poetic way to describe a lucky crossing. But if we look at the geology of the Jordan Valley, the impossible begins to look like a forensic reality. The Jordan River sits directly on an active seismic fault, the Great Rift Valley. The cliffs lining the river are made of unstable marl and clay. When an earthquake strikes this region, it often triggers massive landslides. These aren't just small falls of dirt, they are colossal collapses of the clay cliffs that can completely dam the river's course. This isn't just a theory. It has been documented at least 6 times in recorded history. The most striking evidence occurred as recently as 1927. During a powerful earthquake, the clay banks near the town of Adam collapsed into the river. The flow of the Jordan was completely blocked for 21 hours. For nearly an entire day, the riverbed downstream was dry, exactly as the Bible recounts. The earth itself provided the mechanism for the miracle. The Bible wasn't inventing a tale. It was recording a rare, violent geological event that occurred at the precise moment it was needed. But crossing the Jordan was about more than just surviving the water. In the ancient world, crossing a river of this significance was a profound geopolitical act. It was a formal entry into a new jurisdiction. For the inhabitants of Canaan, seeing a massive population cross their primary defensive barrier wasn't a migration, it was a declaration of war. It was the moment the promise became a physical occupation. This sense of crossing a border remains central even into the time of Jesus. About 90 miles north of the Dead Sea, archaeologists have finally confirmed the site of Jesus' baptism at a place called Bethany beyond the Jordan. For years, the exact location was debated until the 1990s when researchers uncovered the remains of 5 Byzantine churches and a cross-shaped baptismal pool right on the riverbank. The site confirms that the earliest Christians knew exactly where this event took place. But notice the location. Jesus chose to be baptized at the same frontier where Israel first entered the land. By stepping into the Jordan, he wasn't just undergoing a ritual, he was reclaiming the history of his people. He was crossing the same border, but this time, he was bringing a message that would transcend all borders. However, if you visit the Jordan today, you will witness a silent tragedy that the ancient writers could never have imagined. The river that once raged and overflowed is now struggling to survive. Because of massive modern irrigation projects and the installation of industrial pumps at the river's source, the flow of the Jordan has been diverted by 95%. What was once a mighty barrier is now, in many stretches, a mere trickle. This isn't just an environmental crisis. It is a threat to the very existence of the Dead Sea. If the Jordan stops flowing, the lowest place on earth will eventually vanish. This is the great irony of our time. For thousands of years, the Jordan was a force of nature that only God could stop. Today, it is a river that only man can save. We have moved from a time when we needed a miracle to cross the water to a time when the water itself needs a miracle to reach the sea. But the Jordan was only the beginning. Just 5 miles from these banks, the Israelites set up their first camp in a place called Gilgal. And what archaeologists have found there, visible only from the sky, is perhaps the most literal proof of ownership ever carved into the earth. We are moving from the water to the footprints of a nation. Get ready, because what lies ahead at Gilgal will change the way you read the book of Joshua forever. Just 5 miles from the banks of the Jordan, hidden in the sun-drenched plains of the desert, lies a discovery so massive it remained invisible for thousands of years. It was only when we took to the sky that the earth finally yielded its secret. Looking down from a satellite or an airplane, you can see them. Colossal stone structures, hundreds of feet long, perfectly shaped like giant human footprints. For decades, the site of Gilgal, the first camp of the Israelites in the Promised Land, was an archaeological ghost. Researchers combed the region looking for what they expected to find: a traditional city with defensive walls, watchtowers, and mud brick houses. They found nothing, but they were looking for the wrong thing. In the late 20th century, archaeologist Adam Zertel decided to change his perspective. He looked at the landscape from above. What he discovered were 5 massive stone enclosures, known as galgalum. These weren't cities. They were something far more intentional. They were stone outlines of a sandal, some as large as several soccer fields, built with a precision that defies simple explanation. The question is, why a foot? To the modern eye, it looks like a strange artistic choice. But in the ancient world, the shape of the foot was not art. It was a legal signature. Think about the way we sign a deed or a contract today to prove we own a house. In the ancient Near East, you didn't just sign a paper, you walked the land. To set the sole of your foot on a piece of ground was a formal legal act of taking possession. It was a declaration of ownership. This gives us a startling new insight into the words of the Bible. And when the book of Joshua, God repeats a specific promise: "I have given you every place where the sole of your foot treads." For centuries, readers assumed this was poetic imagery, a beautiful way of saying they would conquer the land. But archaeology has revealed that this wasn't poetry. It was a literal legal command. By building these massive foot-shaped enclosures, the Israelites were quite literally signing the land. They were laying down a physical footprint to tell every empire that would follow: this ground has an owner. We have set our feet here. But as the archaeologists dug deeper, they realized these sites served an even more profound purpose. These weren't just legal markers. They were open-air temples. Each footprint features a paved corridor that runs exactly along the inner edge of the stone wall. Evidence suggests that the people would gather here, not to live, but to worship. They would walk in a massive procession around the rim of the footprint, literally treading the outline in a religious ceremony. In fact, the Hebrew word for feast or festival, hag, literally means to move in a circle. Every time they celebrated their arrival in the land, they were physically reenacting the promise. They were walking over these giant stone sandals, reminding themselves that they were only there because God had allowed them to set foot on this holy ground. Today, these footprints of God stand as a silent, irrefutable testimony. They prove that the conquest of Canaan wasn't just a spiritual story, it was a real historical event, documented by people who left their mark in the very stone of the earth. Aren't these structures were built to be seen from above, perhaps for a God they believed was watching over them. But as the Israelites stood in their camp at Gilgal, they only had to lift their eyes to see a nightmare looming on the horizon. Just a few miles away, the massive walls of Jericho stood like an iron gate, blocking their path. It was the oldest city in the world, an impregnable fortress that had never been taken. The battle for the promised land was about to begin. And as we are about to see, the way those walls fell has left a forensic record so precise, it has left even the most hardened skeptics speechless. We are moving from the footprints of Gilgal to the ruins of Jericho, to a city that fell not from an army, but from a sound. Welcome to Jericho. This is the city that shouldn't exist. No, yet it has survived everything history could throw at it. It is the oldest city in the world, the lowest city on earth, and for decades it was the ultimate weapon used by skeptics to claim the Bible was nothing more than a collection of myths. According to the book of Joshua, Jericho was an impregnable fortress. It was a city protected by massive, double walls that had resisted entire civilizations. But the biblical account tells a story that defies military logic. It says that after 7 days of marching in the blast of a trumpet, the walls simply came crashing down. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists laughed at this idea. They called it a fairy tale. But when we stop looking at the stories and start looking at the dirt, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The turning point began with a paradox. In the 1950s, a famed archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon excavated the site of Tel Sultan. Her conclusion was devastating for believers. She claimed that there were no walls at Jericho during the time of Joshua. She argued the city had been destroyed centuries earlier and was a ghost town by the time the Israelites arrived. For 40 years, her word was the final authority. The case was closed. Jericho was a myth, but science is a process of constant reevaluation. Decades later, a new generation of experts re-examined Kenyon's own data. They looked at the pottery styles and the carbon dating that she had overlooked. What they found left the academic world in a state of shock. Kenyon had been wrong. Not only were there massive walls at Jericho during the biblical period, but they had been destroyed in a way that matches the book of Joshua word for word. To understand the miracle, you have to understand the engineering of the city. Jericho was protected by a sophisticated double wall system. At the base was a massive stone retaining wall, nearly 15 feet high. On top of that sat an even larger wall made of red mud bricks. It was a fortress designed to be unscalable. Yet when archaeologists excavated the base of that stone wall, they found something that defied every standard of ancient warfare. They found a mountain of red mud bricks piled up at the outer base of the stone wall. This is a critical forensic detail. In a typical siege, walls are pushed inward by battering rams or collapse inward under their own weight. But the walls of Jericho fell outward. When the red mud bricks from the upper wall tumbled down and created a perfect natural ramp leading from the ground straight to the top of the stone retaining wall. This is exactly what the Bible describes. It says the walls fell down flat, and the people went up into the city, every man straight before him. They didn't need ladders. They didn't need siege engines. The very walls that were meant to keep them out had collapsed to form the bridge that let them in. But the evidence doesn't stop with the walls. It is found in the fire. The Bible says that after the walls fell, the Israelites burned the city and everything in it. Beneath the layer of fallen bricks, archaeologists uncovered a layer of ash and charcoal nearly 3 feet thick. The blaze was so intense that the mud bricks themselves were hardened, in as if they had been fired in a kiln. And inside the ruins of the houses, they found something even more baffling. They found dozens of large clay jars, still filled to the brim with grain. In the ancient world, grain was the most valuable commodity. It was the currency of survival. In a typical conquest, the first thing a victorious army would do is loot the food supply. Why was this grain left behind? It was left because of a specific divine command recorded in the scriptures. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. The Israelites were strictly forbidden from taking any loot from Jericho. The presence of these full jars is a forensic signature. It proves two things that skeptics thought were impossible. First, it proves the siege was very short, only a few days, because the inhabitants hadn't even begun to eat through their food supply. Second, it proves the invaders were not motivated by plunder. They were motivated by obedience. Every jar of burnt grain is a silent witness to a moment in time when history and prophecy collided. The evidence is irrefutable. The walls fell outward. The ramp was formed. The city was burned. And the treasure was left untouched. But Jericho was only the gateway. The conquest of the land required a center of power, a throne for the nation that would endure for millennia. We are moving from the fallen walls of the oldest city to the rising stones of the most contested city on earth. Just 20 miles away, a young king was about to uncover a secret water system that would allow him to take an unconquerable fortress. We are approaching the heart of it all. We are approaching Jerusalem. After the falling walls of Jericho and the legal footprints of Gilgal, the eyes of a young, newly crowned king turned toward the heights. But there was a problem. King David now ruled a united nation of 12 tribes, yet he had no home for his throne. If he chose a city from the tribe of Judah in the south, the northern tribes would be jealous. If he chose a city from the north, his own people would feel betrayed. The nation was at risk of fracturing before it even began. David needed a neutral ground, an ownerless city, a place no tribe could claim as its own. He found it in a small, rocky fortress that had remained unconquered since the days of Joshua, Jebus. To the tactical eye, taking Jebus seemed like an impossible mission. The city sat perched on a steep, narrow ridge, protected on three sides by deep, unforgiving valleys. It was a geological nightmare for any invader. The Jebusites were so confident in their natural defenses that they mocked David from the ramparts. They shouted that even the blind and the lame could defend the city against his army. But David wasn't just a warrior, he was a shepherd. He understood a truth that every desert dweller knows. A city is only as strong as its access to water. Outside the eastern walls, hidden in the valley, lay the Gihon Spring, the only permanent water source for miles. David asked himself a single forensic question. How are the Jebusites getting that water inside their walls without being killed? He knew there had to be a secret. Today, archaeology has confirmed exactly what David found. It is called Warren's Shaft. In the 19th century, explorers uncovered a sophisticated vertical water system carved straight into the bedrock. It was a narrow 40-foot vertical shaft that allowed the Jebusites to lower buckets down to a tunnel connected to the spring. It was the city's lifeline, but it was also its greatest vulnerability. The Bible records that David issued a challenge. Whoever climbs up through the water shaft and strikes the Jebusites shall be chief. Under the cover of darkness, Joab and a small band of elite warriors entered the tunnel at the Gihon Spring. They didn't use battering rams. They didn't use ladders. They climbed through the very veins of the city. By the time the sun rose over the Judean desert, the unconquerable fortress had fallen. Jebus was gone. The city of David was born. He called it Jerusalem. But David understood that for Jerusalem to be the true capital of Israel, it needed more than just a military victory. It needed a soul. It had to become the spiritual axis of the entire nation. He made the most significant political and spiritual move in history. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. He placed the tangible presence of God at the center of the government. In that moment, Jerusalem ceased to be a mere fortress and became the city of peace, the place where the physical earth touched the divine. David dreamed of building a permanent house for the Ark on Mount Moriah, the same site where Abraham had stood centuries earlier. But that honor was reserved for his son, Solomon. Instead of falling into frustration, David spent the final years of his life in a fever of preparation. He stockpiled tons of gold and silver. He organized the priests and the musicians. He worked with the finest architects to draft plans for a building he knew he would never see finished. The temple Solomon eventually raised was a masterpiece of silence and precision. The Bible records a chilling detail. No hammer, chisel, or iron tool was heard at the temple site during its construction. Every stone was shaped and numbered at the quarries miles away, then brought to the mountain and fitted together like a massive holy puzzle. It rose in absolute silence, a colossal structure covered in pure gold that gleamed against the skyline. For nearly 4 centuries, Solomon's temple stood as the axis of the world. It was the only place on earth where the nation's identity was perfectly forged. But as we have seen with Capernaum and Sodom, the earth records the end of empires just as clearly as their beginning. In 586 BC, the horizon went black as the Babylonian army arrived. The siege was merciless. The walls that David had captured were breached, and the Golden Temple was reduced to ash. Yet Jerusalem has a stubborn way of refusing to vanish. Over the next 2,000 years, it would be destroyed and rebuilt dozens of times, layered upon itself until the original city of David was buried deep underground. Today we are still digging through those layers. Every stone we uncover confirms that David's clean water battle was not a legend, but a brilliant military reality. Jerusalem remains the heart of the world's most intense mysteries. But as we move from the heights of the Temple Mount to the quiet valleys nearby, we find a place that represents the very opposite of Jerusalem's power. We are moving from the throne of a king to the birthplace of a savior. Just 5 miles away, a different kind of architecture awaits, one that forces even the most powerful men to become small. We are going to Bethlehem. Just 5 miles south of the marble heights of Jerusalem lies a place where history splits in two. Bethlehem. Its Hebrew name, Beit Lehem, means house of bread, and it was known for centuries as the city of David. But beneath the modern streets and the limestone hills lies a truth that challenges the very nature of human pride. Ancient Bethlehem is built atop a chain of natural caves that have served as shelters and stables for millennia. In one of these humble grottos, a prophecy was fulfilled. Today, the Basilica of the Nativity stands directly over that cave. It is one of the oldest continually operating churches on the planet, having survived fires, invasions, and the slow erosion of time. But to enter this sanctuary, you must first pass through a physical and spiritual test. You won't find a grand, towering entrance here. Instead, you are met with the door of humility. It is a stone entryway so low and so narrow, barely 4 feet high, that it forces every visitor, from world leaders and kings to ordinary tourists, to bow deeply just to get inside. Architecturally, it was modified centuries ago to prevent looters from riding their horses into the church. But spiritually, the message is undeniable. No one approaches the place where God became man without first becoming small. It is a staggering first message. Having in a world that is obsessed with power and stature, Bethlehem begins with an act of forced humility. Once inside, the atmosphere shifts. Deep beneath the high altar, a narrow stairway descends into the original grotto. There, set into the marble floor, a 14-pointed silver star marks the exact spot where the manger once stood. It is the geographic epicenter of the Christian faith. The metal is smooth, worn by the touch of millions of hands that have passed through this darkness over the centuries. It is a place of profound silence. But step outside these holy walls, and the contrast is shattering. Today, Bethlehem is a city defined by a different kind of architecture. To enter the city, you must cross through a 26-foot-tall concrete barrier, twice the height of the old Berlin Wall. This U-shaped barrier physically separates Bethlehem from Jerusalem. While it was built for security, it has turned this ancient city into a kind of cage, isolating its people from the very world that comes to visit its shrines. And here is the truth that the stones alone cannot tell us. In archaeology, we often focus on the ruins, the foundations, and the artifacts. But there is a concept known as the living stones. These are the people, the ancient communities that have lived in this land for 2,000 years, guarding these holy places through every century of conflict. We see the stones of the basilica, but the living stones of Bethlehem are disappearing. In 1947, Christians made up 85% of Bethlehem's population. Today they represent barely 10%. Because of the economic isolation caused by the wall and the lack of opportunity, thousands of Christian families have emigrated. A city is more than its ruins. It is its people. A city of archaeology without a community to inherit it is nothing more than a dead museum. The cradle of Christianity is running out of Christians. These families are the human bridge to the past, and that bridge is being dismantled stone by stone. The tragedy of modern Bethlehem reminds us that the preservation of history is not just about digging in the dirt. It is about the people who give those sites meaning. As we stand at the door of humility, we realize that the greatest evidence of the Bible isn't found in a silver star or a limestone cave. It is found in the endurance of those who still call this land home, despite the walls that hem them in. But Bethlehem was only the beginning of the journey. To understand the man who was born in this cave, we must follow the ancient trade routes 90 miles to the north. We are going to a village so insignificant that historians once doubted it even existed. A place where a master stoneworker raised a child in a home carved directly into the mountain. We are moving from the house of bread to the hills of Galilee. We are going to Nazareth, about 90 miles north of the humble manger in Bethlehem, tucked away in the rugged hills of Galilee, lies a village that was once so insignificant it didn't even appear on the maps of the great Roman Empire. For centuries, historians and skeptics argued that this place was a theological invention, a myth created to fulfill a prophecy. They asked, can anything good come from Nazareth? Today, archaeology has answered that question with the cold, hard evidence of stone. 2,000 years ago, Nazareth was a handful of mud and stone houses clinging to a hillside. It was home to barely 200 people. It was a place of silence, far from the power of Jerusalem and the luxury of Rome. But there is a secret about Nazareth that changes everything we thought we knew about the life of Jesus. Most of us grew up hearing that Jesus was the son of a carpenter. We imagine a workshop filled with the scent of cedar and saws cutting through wood. But the original Greek text of the Bible uses a very specific word, tekton. While we translate this as carpenter, in the context of first-century Galilee, it meant something far more profound. A tekton was a master builder, a craftsman who worked with the most abundant material in the land, limestone. In the hills of Galilee, wood was a rare luxury, a reserve for the wealthy. But stone was everywhere. Jesus and his father, Joseph, weren't just making furniture, they were stonemasons. They were master builders who shaped the very foundations of their world. They spent their days in the heat of the sun, quarrying massive blocks of limestone, chiseling them with precision, and fitting them together to build the homes and synagogues of the region. This wasn't a life of delicate hand-carving. It was a life of grit, immense physical strength, and a deep, intimate understanding of the rock of the earth. And we have found the very house where this training likely began. For years, the academic world ignored a site located beneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent. It was dismissed as an ordinary Roman dwelling. But in 2004, a British archaeologist re-examined the site and uncovered a masterpiece of ancient engineering. He found a first-century house carved directly into the limestone hillside. This wasn't just a house built on the rock. It was a house born from the rock. It features expertly carved stairs, a cistern for water, and walls that were shaped with the precision of a master tekton. The Byzantines were so convinced this was the home where Jesus was nurtured that they built a magnificent church directly over it to protect it. To stand in that cave today is to see the physical environment that shaped the mind of the Messiah. He grew up inside the earth he had created, learning to master the stones that would one day become the metaphors for his ministry. The chief cornerstone, the rock of ages. But if Nazareth was so small and hidden, why was it chosen? Skeptics often point to its isolation as proof of its irrelevance. But a closer look at the geography reveals a brilliant strategic paradox. Just 4 miles away from this quiet hillside ran the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea. This was the most important international highway of the ancient world, the artery that connected the empires of Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Nazareth sat like a quiet balcony overlooking the heartbeat of the world. Jesus didn't grow up in total isolation. From the heights of his village, he could watch the dust rising from the caravans of merchants, the marching of Roman legions, and the flow of every culture under the sun. God chose to hide his son where no one would think to look, yet placed him exactly where he could see everything. He grew up hidden in plain sight, watching the world go by before he stepped out to change it forever. Nazareth was the perfect training ground, a place of silence where the master builder prepared to lay the foundation for a kingdom that would never end. However, just 2 days' walk along that same international highway, the quiet hills of Galilee give way to the staggering luxury of the coast. We are moving from the humble stoneworker's home to the dream city of a tyrant, a city of marble avenues, seafront palaces, and an engineering marvel that was eventually swallowed by the waves. We are going to the place where the name of a biblical villain was found carved in stone, proving once and for all that the trial of Jesus was not a legend, but a historical reality. We are going to Caesarea Maritima. From the humble hidden home of a stonemason in Nazareth, on the ancient trade route of the Via Maris carries us just 2 days' journey to the coast. Here, the quiet hills of Galilee give way to a staggering display of Roman luxury and human hubris. Welcome to Caesarea Maritima, the dream city of Herod the Great. Herod was a man obsessed with legacy. He wanted to build a capital that would make Rome itself jealous. He chose a stretch of coastline that was almost a perfectly straight line, a place where it was impossible for ships to find shelter from the Mediterranean swell. But Herod refused to let geography dictate his ambition. He ordered his engineers to do the unthinkable: create an artificial harbor on a scale the world had never seen. They used a revolutionary new technology, hydraulic concrete that hardened underwater. They lowered massive wooden crates filled with this mixture into the sea to form two titanic breakwaters that pushed out from the beach, curving like giant stone arms to cradle the water. Inside those arms, the sea was perfectly still, while outside the waves crashed with a fury that could sink any ship. It was an engineering miracle. Surrounding this port, Herod raised a metropolis of white marble, seafront palaces, and a theater that could hold thousands. He named it after Caesar Augustus, making it clear that this city was a monument to power, propaganda, and the supremacy of Rome. For centuries, Caesarea was the seat of Roman power in Judea, and it is here that archaeology provided what many call the smoking gun of the New Testament. To understand the weight of this discovery, you have to realize that for nearly 2,000 years, when there was a massive hole in the historical record, the name Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who ordered the crucifixion of Jesus, appeared only in the pages of the Bible and a few later Christian writings. Outside of the Gospels, there was no conclusive contemporary proof that he even existed. Skeptics argued that Pilate was a literary invention, a character created by the early church to provide a villain for their story. They claimed that if a man of his importance had truly ruled Judea, the stones of Rome would have recorded his name. In 1961, the stones finally spoke. While excavating the ancient theater at Caesarea, an Italian archaeologist uncovered a limestone block that had been reused as a step in a staircase. When he flipped the stone over and cleaned its surface, he found a perfectly carved Latin inscription. And it read, Pontius Pilatus, Prefectus Judaiae. The silence of 2 millennia was broken. This wasn't a later copy or a religious text. It was an official Roman dedication. It was solid forensic evidence that Pontius Pilate was a real man, holding a real office, at the precise moment in history described in the Bible. The news was a devastating blow to the skeptics. It proved that the Passion of Christ did not happen in a vacuum of myth, but within a tangible, documented political system. But Caesarea held more than just names. It held the turning points of a movement. It was in this city that the Apostle Peter entered the home of a Roman centurion named Cornelius, breaking every social and religious law of the day to declare that the message of Jesus was for the whole world, not just a single nation. And years later, it was in these very seafront palaces that the Apostle Paul was held as a prisoner for 2 years. In 2024, researchers believe they have identified the damp stone rooms that may have served as Paul's cells. Imagine him there, gazing out through the bars at the Mediterranean horizon, knowing that the same sea that brought the Romans to Judea would soon carry him to the heart of the empire. Paul invoked his right as a Roman citizen to be tried in Rome, a move that would ultimately cost him his life but launch Christianity into the center of the world. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson of Caesarea isn't found in its standing ruins, but in what lies beneath the waves. The port that Herod built to defy nature eventually surrendered to it. A combination of earthquakes, tsunamis, and shifting tectonic plates brought the titanic structure down. Today, the real Caesarea is a city of shadows on the seafloor. Divers descend to find fallen columns encrusted with coral and ancient anchors trapped in the sand. It is a haunting reminder that while the pride of man sinks into the deep, the truth preserved in the dust endures. At this point, you might find yourself asking a difficult question. Why do we need these stones? Why do we need to find a name carved in a theater or city under the sea to believe? It's a tension many of us feel. Some argue that looking for physical proof is a sign of weak faith, but we need to see science and archaeology for what they truly are. Science is not the enemy of belief. It is the gardener of truth. It doesn't create the fruit, but it clears away the weeds and the dust of centuries so we can see the fruit for what it is. If we don't search for these stones to prove God, we find them to show a skeptical world that the Bible isn't a collection of legends. It is a record of real people, in real places, who faced real consequences. These discoveries are like black box from a distant past, recovered so that we, 2,000 years later, can have the certainty that our faith is grounded in reality. But as we leave the sunken ruins of Caesarea and follow the trade routes north to the Sea of Galilee, we find a place that represents the very opposite of Herod's marble city. We are going to a small fishing village that became the base for a ministry that would outlast every Roman governor. A place where a humble house was transformed into a sanctuary of gathering. We are going to Capernaum. From the sunken marble of Caesarea, the ancient road carries us north, following the trade routes back to a quiet inland lake ringed with green hills. This is the Sea of Galilee, and on its northern shore, we find a place that was once the very heartbeat of a movement. Capernaum. The Gospels call it Jesus' own city. It was here that he chose to establish the hub of his ministry, a strategic crossroads where the world flowed in and out along the Via Maris. For centuries, Capernaum was nothing more than a ghost, a name mentioned in ancient texts with no physical location. Many assumed it had been lost to the fog of time. But in the late 19th century, archaeologists began to peel back the layers of the Galilee soil, and what they found was a city frozen in black volcanic rock. At the center of the ruins, a massive synagogue stands as a striking landmark. While the white limestone structure you see today dates to the 4th century, the real discovery lies beneath its floors. Archaeologists uncovered the foundations of a much older building, a synagogue made of dark, black basalt. This is the forensic evidence of the very place where Jesus stood and taught. The stones confirm that this was not just a religious center, but the exact platform for a message that would eventually reshape the Roman Empire. But just 30 meters away, across a narrow basalt street, lies the most intimate discovery in all of Galilee. Excavators uncovered a house that stood apart from every other dwelling in the village. While the surrounding homes remained simple, this specific house was transformed very early on into a place of gathering. Its walls were covered in ancient graffiti, prayers and invocations written in Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. Among them, the name of Peter. This is the house of Simon Peter, the same house where the sick were healed, where crowds pressed so tightly against the door that a roof had to be lowered to reach the master. The archaeology reveals a living memory passed down through generations. The first Christians didn't just remember where it happened. They protected the site, eventually building an octagonal basilica over the ruins to mark it as holy ground. To stand there today is to realize that these weren't just stories. These were real moments occurring in a real house, documented by the hands of those who witnessed them. Yet despite its privilege and its prosperity, Capernaum today is a field of ruins. It is a city of shadows. And it is here that we find one of the most unsettling proofs of the Bible's accuracy. At the height of the city's success, when Capernaum was a thriving center of trade and miracles, Jesus issued a chilling warning. He declared, "And you, Capernaum, will you be lifted to the heavens? No, you will go down to Hades." He prophesied that even though the city had seen more miracles than almost any other place on earth, it would ultimately be brought to nothing. Look at the evidence of history. Most cities in this region were destroyed by the sword of an invader or the fire of a revolt. Jerusalem was burned. Jericho was leveled. But Capernaum suffered a different fate, one that matches the prophecy with surgical precision. It wasn't destroyed by an army, it was destroyed by the slow, unstoppable march of being forgotten. After the 7th century, when the city began to fade, people simply moved away. The trade routes shifted, the houses were abandoned, and the black basalt was slowly swallowed by weeds and dust. It didn't fall in a single night of violence, it simply evaporated from the map. Capernaum's true value today is its silence. It stands as a ruin, proving that the word of a prophet can be more lethal than the edge of a sword. It is a stark reminder of the law of cause and effect, that to whom much is given, much is expected. Capernaum was lifted to the heavens by the presence of the Messiah, but today it lies in the depths of the earth, just as he said it would. It is a city that died not because of war, but because of a spiritual and historical fadeaway. But as we leave the ruins of Galilee and cross the desert to the east, we are approaching a place where the air itself feels different, a mountain that guards the beginning of it all, where a law was given that would shape the foundation of human civilization. We are going to a place shrouded in fire and smoke, a mystery that scientists and pilgrims are still trying to solve. We are going to the mountain of God. We are going to Mount Sinai. Leaving the ruins of Galilee behind, we step into the deepest hush on earth. We are entering a wilderness that seems endless, yet it guards the most awe-inspiring location in the Old Testament. This is the place where a law was given that would shape the very DNA of human civilization. Welcome to the mountain of God. Welcome to Mount Sinai. To this day, Mount Sinai remains one of the greatest geographical mysteries in history. No map was left behind, or no permanent marker was placed. For centuries, pilgrims have journeyed to the southern Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, to a peak known as Jebel Musa. This tradition dates back to the 4th century, when Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine, identified this as the holy site. It is a powerful, unbroken tradition. Millions have climbed these steps in search of the divine. But as we dig into the text of the Bible, a different, startling possibility emerges. The Apostle Paul, writing in the book of Galatians, makes a specific geographic claim. He states that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. This single clue has led a new generation of researchers across the Gulf of Aqaba to a mountain called Jebel al-Lawz in modern-day Saudi Arabia. And what they have found there is breathtaking. When you look at Jebel al-Lawz from a distance, you notice something that defies geological logic. The base of the mountain is composed of light, sandy-colored granite, typical for this desert region. But the summit is different. The top of the mountain is pitch black. It looks as if the entire peak has been scorched by an intense, overwhelming fire. For decades, skeptics claimed this was simply volcanic rock, but chemical analysis has revealed a different truth. The rocks at the summit are not volcanic. They are granite that has been heated from the outside to such an extreme temperature that the molecular structure of the stone changed. It is as if the peak was baked by a heat source that came from above, perfectly matching the biblical description of the mountain burning with fire and smoke like a furnace. But while the peak in Arabia offers physical evidence of fire, the traditional site in Egypt holds a miracle of preservation that cannot be ignored. At the foot of the mountain sits St. Catherine's Monastery. This is the oldest continuously operating Christian monastery in the world. Its massive walls, rising 15 meters high, were built as a fortress in the 6th century by Emperor Justinian. In over 1,500 years, it has never been destroyed. It survived the rise of empires and the sweep of countless invasions. It even holds a letter of protection purportedly signed by the Prophet Muhammad himself, ensuring its safety through centuries of Islamic rule. Inside these ancient fortified walls, a specific shrub continues to grow. The monks believe it is a direct descendant of the burning bush, the place where God first called Moses. Biologically, this is a Rubus sanctus, a rare species of bramble. What is truly remarkable is that this is the only specimen of its kind in the entire Sinai Peninsula. Every attempt to transplant a cutting of this bush to another location has failed. It remains tied to this specific soil, a living witness to a moment of divine encounter that refused to be consumed by time. But the monastery's greatest treasure isn't made of leaves. It is made of parchment. For centuries, its library has safeguarded the second most important collection of ancient manuscripts in the world, surpassed only by the Vatican. It was here that the Codex Sinaiticus was discovered, one of the oldest complete Bibles in existence, dating back to the 4th century. This manuscript provides irrefutable proof that the words we read in our Bibles today have remained unchanged for over 1,600 years. The Mount Sinai is a place of absolute silence. Whether it is the blackened peaks of Arabia or the ancient stones of Egypt, the message is the same. This mountain is nearly 800 million years old. It stood there long before the pyramids were built and long before the first king of Israel was crowned. It remains a silent witness to a moment when the law of heaven touched the earth. It is a place to seek direction before embarking on a great mission. But while Sinai represents the giving of the law, our journey now carries us to a city that represents the ultimate rebellion against that law. We are crossing the desert to the east, following the path of exile that thousands of chained captives once walked. We are approaching a place of gold, of pride, and of ultimate judgment. We are going to the plains of modern-day Iraq, to the banks of the Euphrates. We are going to Babylon. From the silence of Sinai, we cross the eastern desert, following the same path of exile that thousands of chained captives walked 2,500 years ago. We are approaching the plains of modern-day Iraq to the banks of the Euphrates River. Welcome to Babylon, the city of gold, the throne of pride, and the stage for one of the most unsettling mysteries in the book of Genesis. Babylon was once the absolute center of the world. Its walls were legendary, wide enough for 2 chariots to pass each other at the top. Its hanging gardens were a wonder of the ancient world. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, it was the pinnacle of human achievement. But for centuries, the story that defines this place, the Tower of Babel, was dismissed as a primitive myth, a simple explanation for why we speak different languages. But when we look at the archaeology of the soil, the myth starts to look like a construction report. The Bible records that after the flood, humanity settled in the land of Shinar and decided to build a tower that would reach the heavens. It even specifies the technology they used. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. This is a critical forensic detail. In most of the ancient world, stone was the primary building material, but in the plains of Shinar, stone was rare. Archaeologists have discovered that the great ziggurats of Babylon, like the Itamananki, were built exactly as described, with millions of kiln-fired bricks bound together by bitumen, a naturally occurring tar. We have even found a black stone stele featuring King Nebuchadnezzar himself standing next to a colossal 7-tiered pyramid. The inscription is astonishing. The king boasts that he gathered people from many lands and every language to complete a tower that had been started by an ancient king but left unfinished for centuries. This isn't just a story. It is an archaeological record of a project so ambitious it required a global workforce. But it's the confusion of languages that has always been the hardest part for skeptics to swallow. How could one language suddenly become many? For years, this was seen as a fairy tale, until we discovered the Sumerian tablets. In a very ancient text called Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada, archaeologists found a startling parallel. It speaks of a time when everyone spoke a single tongue, until the god Enki confused their words. Here we have an external, non-biblical source from the very same region, describing the exact same event. It suggests that the black box of human memory recorded a traumatic, sudden shift in human communication that happened right here in the shadow of these towers. However, the most chilling evidence for the early chapters of Genesis didn't come from a tower, but from a list of kings. For centuries, the world mocked the opening chapters of the Bible because of the lifespans it recorded. We read of Methuselah living 969 years and Adam living 930. To the modern mind, this is biologically impossible. It was dismissed as Hebrew fantasy. Then we unearthed the Sumerian king list. This is a series of clay tablets written in cuneiform, the oldest writing system known to man. It records the succession of kings who ruled Mesopotamia for nearly 30,000 years. And here is where the overlap gets uncomfortable for skeptics. The list is divided into 2 distinct eras, the kings who ruled before the flood and the kings who ruled after it. The list states that the first 8 kings ruled for spans of thousands of years each. Then the tablet contains a single haunting line: the flood swept over. Immediately following that line, the reigns of the kings plunge. They drop from thousands of years to hundreds of years and finally to decades. This matches the genealogical records in Genesis with surgical precision. Both the Bible and an independent Sumerian record report the same bizarre phenomenon: that there was a time when human lifespans were vastly longer, and that a worldwide deluge triggered a sudden, dramatic shift in the Earth's biology. Think about the weight of that. Two different cultures with two different religions reporting the exact same biological cliff at the exact same point in history. This isn't a coincidence. It is a shared memory of a lost world. It confirms that the patriarchs of Genesis weren't metaphors. They were the survivors of a world that functioned differently than our own. Babylon was the peak of human pride, a system that sought to supplant God with its own gold and its own towers. But the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah issued a warning when the city was at its height. They said it would become like Sodom and Gomorrah, deserted forever, a field of ruins where no one would dwell from generation to generation. At the time, that sounded as absurd as saying London or New York would be abandoned for eternity. Yet look at the map today. Unlike Rome, Jerusalem, or Athens, which always rose again, Babylon remains a field of dust and buried bricks. Even Saddam Hussein's attempt to rebuild the palace in the 1980s ended in a complete failure. The prophecy of silence was fulfilled to the letter. We have moved from the confusion of languages to the record of lost ages. But our journey is not over. We are returning to northern Israel, to a hill that commands the most strategic valley on the planet, a place where the ruins of 26 different civilizations are stacked like a layer cake of war. We are going to the stage where the Bible says the final confrontation of history will take place. We are going to Armageddon. We have traveled from the sunken streets of Caesarea to the towers of Babylon. But now we return to the heart of the Promised Land, to a hill that commands the most strategic valley on the planet. This is Tel Megiddo. To the untrained eye, it looks like a large, flat-topped hill rising out of the Jezreel Valley. But look closer. This is not a work of nature. It is a layer cake of human blood, pride, and ambition. Archaeologists have uncovered 26 distinct layers of ruins here, stacked one on top of the other like a graveyard of empires. Every layer represents a civilization that believed it would last forever, only to be buried by the next. For over 5,000 years, this Thung Lung has witnessed more wars than any other spot on the globe. Canaanites, Egyptians, Israelites, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all have fought and died on this ground. And this is the most coveted strategic point of the ancient world, because whoever controlled this hill controlled the Via Maris, the international highway that linked empires. The stones of Megiddo are an archive of evidence that seems to illustrate the verses of the Old Testament word for word. As you walk through the ruins, you come upon massive, six-chambered gates. This defensive work aligns precisely with the description in the first book of Kings, which notes that King Solomon fortified Jerusalem, Hazor, and Megiddo. Nearby, archaeologists unearthed enormous stable complexes designed to hold hundreds of horses, confirming that Megiddo was a chariot city, a high-tech hub of military power, exactly as the Bible portrays it. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery lies underground. To survive a siege, you need water. The inhabitants of Megiddo engineered a colossal water system, a 30-meter-deep vertical shaft linked to a 70-meter tunnel cut straight through the bedrock to reach a hidden spring outside the walls. To walk through that tunnel and trace the pick marks on those rock walls is to touch the desperation of a people preparing for the inevitable. It is the very atmosphere described in the books of Kings and Chronicles. The record of history here is so precise that it even confirms the deaths of kings. The Bible relates that King Josiah, one of the last righteous rulers of Judah, went out to face Pharaoh Necho of Egypt and fell mortally wounded at Megiddo. For years, critics looked for proof of this encounter. Then in 2025, researchers uncovered massive quantities of 7th century BC Egyptian pottery at the site, while confirming the presence of the very army that defeated the biblical king. Once again, history lined up with prophecy. But the name of this hill has a resonance that reaches far beyond the past. In Hebrew, it is called Har Megiddo. In Greek, this was rendered as Armageddon. According to the book of Revelation, this is the stage where the final confrontation of human history will take place. But why choose this hill for the climax of the human story? Because Megiddo has always been the collision point of the world. It is the geographic center where the roots of Africa, Asia, and Europe converge. It is the place where the world's conflicts have always been decided. The Bible says that for Armageddon to happen, a global system called Babylon, a web of power, money, and pride that dominates the world, must first collapse. In the midst of that power vacuum and chaos, the leaders of the earth will gather their forces here for one last battle. But this is not a hollow cycle of violence. Scripture says that heaven will open and a rider on a white horse will appear. His name is the Word of God. From his mouth comes a sharp sword symbolizing his own truth. The same God who created the universe with a single word will bring the rebellion of the nations to an end by the sheer power of his reality. Armageddon is the proof that history is not a chaotic circle, but a road moving toward an appointed destination. It is the final black box of the human journey. Megiddo has watched kings die and empires fall for 5 millennia. And according to the Bible, it is waiting to watch the final victory of truth over deception. We have traveled through 13 biblical places, from the marble of Jerusalem to the mud of Babylon. We have touched the stones, analyzed the heat, and seen the footprints. And now we can finally answer the question we asked at the beginning. Is what we read in the Bible true? The earth has replied with a resounding yes. Our journey has reached its destination, but the story it tells is only beginning. We have journeyed through 13 biblical locations, from the sunken marble of Caesarea to the ancient, scorched bricks of Babylon. The evidence is clear. The earth does not lie. For years, skeptics claimed these stories were nothing more than beautiful myths. But the ground itself has spoken. Science is not here to refute faith. It is here to bear witness to it. We have seen that the black boxes of geology and archaeology preserve the truth of the scriptures with surgical precision. But these stones are more than just a record of the past. They are a challenge for the present. Do not be like the ruins of Capernaum, hollow, soulless, and forgotten by time. Instead, be the living stones. Carry the truth within you, just as the desert protected the scrolls. Let your life be the evidence that the message of the Bible is still active and real today. The physical proof of the word is staggering, but the story is far from over. There are 10 specific objects that actually touch the physical body of Jesus and still exist in our world today. These artifacts were at the cross, inside the tomb, and witnesses to the resurrection. If you want to see the ultimate irrefutable proof, you need to watch the video on your screen right now. Click here to discover the 10 authentic artifacts of Jesus. Blessings to you and your family.